Hi everyone, it's Duchess. The process of localizing Japanese video games for Western audiences has always involved certain changes to account for cultural differences. However, in recent years, the scope of alterations made in localization has expanded beyond simple translation. More and more, Japanese games are being edited and censored during localization in ways that many feel politicize the games and strip them of original content. Even well-regarded franchises like Fire Emblem and Tokyo Mirage Sessions have had content modified or completely removed in order to adhere to perceived Western sensitivities and political correctness. Fanservice, sexuality, and mature themes often get targeted in this process. While localizing for different regions will always require localization, the argument can be made that studios have gone too far in the name of political sensitivity and sanitization. This video will examine examples of how heavy-handed localization edits and censorship have impacted Japanese games, the motivations and policy changes behind the shifts, and why studios and publishers may need to recalibrate their approaches to avoid stripping away the creative essence and intent of developers in Japan. One of the most well-known examples of perceived over-localization happened with Nintendo's handling of Fire Emblem Fates in 2016. The Japanese version contained a minigame where players could interact with and customize their relationships with other characters, including petting and stroking them using touch controls. However, for the Western release, Nintendo completely removed this controversial feature, altering substantial parts of the game's relationship and romance systems. While altering some content to suit cultural norms is expected, completely cutting this major mechanic fundamentally changed the original creative vision. Critics saw it as a form of censorship catering to online outrage and politics rather than finding reasonable localization compromises. It set off renewed debates about how adapting games for new regions should balance necessary changes for new audiences and cultures with preserving the core experience envisioned by creators in Japan. As more Japanese franchises get altered in similar ways, fans have raised concerns about an escalating trend of overly political localization that censors and whitewashes their favorite series. Even in the early days of localization, Japanese games were often changed to be more culturally acceptable or politically correct for Western audiences. A famous example is the case of the sleeping man in the original Japanese releases of Pokemon Red and Blue. In the Japanese version, a man blocking the path in one town is described as being drunk and passed out. However, for the international releases, this was changed to say the man was merely sleeping, removing the alcohol reference. Other examples from early Nintendo games include removing religious iconography and references to alcohol, gambling, or violence to aim their games at a broader, useful audience. During the 90s, these localization changes were typically more small-scale, involving dialogue and visual changes similar to The Sleeping Man. However, the precedent for altering Japanese content for perceived cultural suitability was established decades ago. While modern editing and censorship controversies are more extreme in scale, the practice of localization modifications emerged early in gaming history. More recently, the popular JRPG franchise Tokyo Mirage Sessions FE sparked criticism over its Western localization. Compared to the Japanese version, the Western release had numerous visual changes that censored and toned down the game's fanservice anime aesthetic. Revealing character outfits were made more modest and provocative camera angles were altered. The localization team worried the original costumes will elicit controversy. Additionally, some dialogue was changed to be less risque or overly referential to Japanese culture, stripping away the game's Tokyo setting. While the intention was to avoid a potential backlash, many fans felt fundamental aspects of the game's tone and style were lost. Altering a creator's vision to preempt imagined offense or outrage can run counter to the appeal of experiencing different cultural media. As with Fire Emblem's changes, fans increasingly see overly cautious localization edits as another form of censorship, diluting the original work. Atlus's Persona 5 Royal provides a revealing case study into shifting localization standards. For the expanded Royal Edition, Atlus altered or removed several jokes from the original Persona 5 script to be more sensitive. For example, the flamboyant artist Yusuke at one point made comments with implied homophobic tones, but these were changed to remove that connotation. Similarly, some perverted gags by the character Ryuji were toned down to be less offensive. Fans argue staying faithful to the spirit of the original script should take priority rather than attempting to adhere to another culture's standards. As Persona grows increasingly popular worldwide, its localization changes exemplify the tensions around properly balancing cultural adaptation versus preserving creative integrity. Localization controversies around major Japanese franchises now goes far beyond the amusing translation mishaps of gaming's early days. Questionable changes once manifested in unintentionally silly phrases like "all your bases are belong to us" from poor translations. However, current localization disputes revolve around systemic content edits that alter core parts of the original work rather than just language. Policies around removing sexual, violent, or politically sensitive Japanese content changes the fundamental tone and cultural context of the media. Where localizers once had more creative freedom to preserve the Japanese experience, restrictive regulations now pressure teams to sanitize games. This excessive censorship threatens to dilute the diversity that made Japanese games appealing to worldwide fans in the first place. While balanced localization will always be necessary, the trend of heavy-handed changes now raises concerns about neutering the vibrant Japanese creative spirit that gave rise to iconic series like Final Fantasy, Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil, and more. Japanese media, like anime and games, often reflect cultural values and artistic expressions that differ from Western norms. Japanese storytelling integrates mature themes like sexuality, moral ambiguity, and provocative fan service absent in American media targeting youth. Societal standards around nudity, gender roles, and appropriate content vary greatly between the cultures. While localized games understandably require some translation adjustments, overly sanitizing inherent Japanese sensibilities strips away cultural context. Media like Persona or Tokyo Mirage Sessions FE lose their identity when stripped of risque humor or anime tropes. Preserving authentic, diverse perspectives should take priority over catering to imagined offense. Japanese creators work within their own cultural context and should not have to censor their artistic visions. While localization necessitates balancing cultural adaptation with preserving original intent, dismissing core values as universally inappropriate is presumptuous. Media crosses borders to share culture, not mix it. Japanese games should not have to sacrifice cultural identity simply because values differ from the West. The heart of the issue lies in finding the appropriate balance between necessary localization and excessive censorship. Some content changes are reasonable, like altering overly sexualized depictions of underage characters to suit laws and norms prohibiting such content. Translating and reformatting text for different languages is also expected. However, the key is identifying where that line gets crossed into fundamentally altering core artistic vision based on perceived cultural differences or risk of offending sensitive audiences. Studios like Nintendo have established global policies eliminating entire categories of content regardless of creator intent or context, but preemptively removing elements deemed inappropriate rather than trusting audiences reflects presumed value judgments. Localization catering to vocal online groups and politics breeds games afraid to touch on meaningful cultural topics. There are fears Japanese creators will start compromising their concepts from the outset to avoid localization trouble later. While strides have been made in recent years, there remains work to be done in reforming rigid guidelines into a more flexible collaborative process that respects both localization needs and creative integrity. And that's my take on this. Thank you for watching the video. If you're someone who loves exploring the depths of the gaming community, hit that subscribe button below and turn on notifications by clicking the bell icon. See you guys later.